I had been intending to open today with that old witticism, much beloved, of best men at weddings and dads at 21st, and go, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, and then launch into the talk. But unfortunately, my version of the sinusy cold that everyone's had for the last few weeks has been an ear infection, which has rendered me partially deaf, effectively, for the last couple of weeks. So I feel like I'm talking in a fishbowl. And I'm also still a bit hoarse, so I apologise if I'm not entirely clear and if I'm a bit hoarse. And when it comes to the Q&A, please use the microphones provided and speak up, because I am genuinely a little bit deaf at the moment. Okay, when I first worked behind the counter of a chain bookshop in suburban Canberra shopping mall in 1990, yes, I am that old, there were 2 cash registers, 1 telephone, a microfiche reader for the books in print, which was shared among the regional bookshops, so it was probably about 6 months old by the time we got it anyway. And in the back room, the latest in technology, a fax machine. We memorised the stock on hand on the shelves, and we used to do stock checks and write up reorders by hand on carbon pads, faxing a copy of the carbon to publishers and distributors, where a small army of customer service employees would be keying the orders into ancient green screen computers. While there was a head office for the chain and some central buyers of major titles, the store manager, the lovely Meredith Wright, who's still selling books in Canberra, spent much of her week seeing publishers' sales reps, and she had autonomy on ordering most of the stock for the shop. In ensuing 20-ish years, many things have changed, but other than a few hiccups such as the introduction of the GST in 2000 and the collapse of Collins Booksellers in 2005, which was quickly reborn Phoenix-like as a successful franchise network, the Australian book industry developed, matured, and actually grew quite steadily throughout the 1990s and 2000s. As a caveat, though, I've got to say, selling books has never been that profitable. Publishing is gambling writ large, and the returns are always modest. Single-figure net profits and market growth are thought of as good, but if they're viewed compounding over 20 years, there certainly was growth. Another quick aside, which actually is not quick because it's quite long, I'll be talking here about the mainstream trade side of the book industry, which is essentially the reading for pleasure, commercial publishing, and the retail business that sells its products. Without even thinking of publishing more widely, such as newspapers, magazines, online, etc., book publishing as an industry is almost half educational publishing, from primary school materials to high school textbooks, tertiary texts and professional journals. This is a large and important part of the industry, but one that's largely beyond my remit here. We'll touch on it to an extent when we discuss the consolidated multinational publishing businesses, which often combine trade and educational book publishing alongside mass media properties. One of the main catalysts for the development of the Australian book industry were the 1991 changes to the Copyright Act, which enshrined the parallel importation restrictions that have been in contention so often since. By creating a solid, protected market for local editions of overseas-originated books, a portfolio model for publishing companies became the norm. Both locally owned independent publishers such as Allen & Unwin, Text, Scribe, Black Ink, Hardy Grant and many others, and the local branches of the big international publishers, Penguin, Random, HarperCollins, Macmillan, etc., developed businesses that combined what are called buy-ins of overseas-originated titles alongside their local books. As these companies grew, they were better equipped to participate in the international rights market at events such as the Frankfurt, London and Bologna book fairs, and to there sell rights in their Australian books into many other territories and languages. There's a downside to this model, though, and one which we're beginning to appreciate more and more. It's estimated that for many of the larger companies, they're reliant on the sales of their overseas-derived titles for up to 55% of their revenue. If, as we get to shortly, a growing proportion of Australian readers are buying these books online and offshore, a crucial part of Australian publishers' business model is being eroded. Book selling was pretty healthy as well through the 90s and 2000s. Independently owned bookshops maintained a substantial market share. Chain stores served the mass market well, and the massive discounting wars that distorted the US and UK book trades and moved much of book selling there into supermarkets and discount mass retailers were largely averted here. But then a few years ago, something happened. Or rather, a few somethings coincided. It wasn't sudden, and to be honest, we'd known all along it was coming, but we still weren't prepared for its impact. Amazon started selling books online in 1995, and many other online sellers, local and global, followed. The momentum took a while to build among the general public, but before long it was easy to look up any book online and do price comparisons. It was no longer an automatic choice to buy books at your local bricks and mortar bookshop. But much of the time, even if an individual title seemed much cheaper overseas, exchange rates and shipping costs meant that it wasn't all that much cheaper by the time it got to your door. But once the Australian dollar got to parity with the US dollar, and then some, and stayed there, and got to 60p against the pound, the massive scale and loss-leading discounting of Amazon and the book depository, which, by the way, are now under the same ownership if you didn't realise that, meant that the sort of book that was $30 in your local bookshop, and which really needs to be $30 to cover its costs, but that's an argument for another time, could be had at your door in a matter of days for half that. E-books are also a slow burner and have been talked about in the trade since the 1990s. But until the rise of the Kindle and similar inexpensive, always online handheld devices, there wasn't much of a commercial argument for e-books. But again, the speed of take-up of e-books since 2007 has been phenomenal. It was Amazon, again, who jumped in and dominated the e-book market and drove the perception that e-books should cost $9.99 or even less. Remember, Dymocks tried to start selling e-books in Australia in 2007, not all that successfully. Then Australians got access to Kindle in late 2009, Kobo via Angus and Robertson and Borders in May 2010. Apple iBooks and Google eBooks both came here only in November 2010, and local startup Bookish only started selling ebooks via Readings and then other independent bookshops in January 2011. This is all very recent, and so it's not all that surprising that the local trade has taken a while to catch up with ebook developments. In Australia, ebooks are probably less than 10% of overall publisher revenue, but in the US, ebooks now make up close to a quarter of mainstream publishers' revenues, and there are many titles, especially genre and popular fiction titles, that are ebook dominant or ebook only in some cases. The proportion of books sold as ebooks will continue to grow. Will it plateau? We don't know. The 2011 collapse of Red Group, the private equity-funded owner of Borders and Angus and Robertson, wasn't directly due to online competition or ebooks. It really was about a poor business model that simply didn't suit the book industry. But the aftermath of the Red Group collapse has been very instructive. Red Group's market share, at least a high teens proportion of mainstream Australian book sales, just hasn't been replaced. That proportion of the retail market was already gone online and offshore. Local publishers are suffering, of course, and many have reported that their sales in the last year or two are 20% or more down on previous years. I'm going to move away now from the historical explication and get dot pointy, which was a word I invented the other day, with some assertions and predictions about where things might be headed. It's important to note that the following assertions are and statements, not or. There will be print books and e-books. There will be large publishers and small ones. There will be bookshops on our streets and there will be online sellers delivering to our doors and our devices. There will be authors who do exceedingly well by self-publishing and by handling their own affairs, and there will be authors who will benefit from having a traditional publisher back them. But what is clear is that the established ways of doing business in book world have changed forever. So I have a few assertions and then a few predictions, and we'll see where we go from there. My first assertion is actually a very positive one. Book culture in Australia is currently very healthy. There are writers' festivals all over the country that draw crowds into the tens of thousands. The Wheeler Centre hosts something close to, I believe, 1,000 events a year, Donica? Not really? Many events anyway. Many events every day, which would have to add up to hundreds a year. Most nights you'll find a book launch or an author event being held at a local bookshop, certainly in the capital cities. Children's authors are out and about in schools and libraries. Genre writing and publishing with passionate fans are holding more and bigger events. GenreCon was held in Brisbane last weekend and was, I believe, a very big event. There's things that used to be comic cons and fan conventions for science fiction and fantasy fans are now increasingly important as book publishing events, and book publishers are going to them as a way to connect directly with very passionate and engaged audiences. As we heard this morning in the sessions of the Spunk Conference, literary magazines, which you may well have thought were an endangered species, are actually doing very well. And there are many small magazines in Australia that have older ones that have kept themselves going, like Meanjin and Overland, but a lot of new players in a very burgeoning literary magazine market. Going Down Swinging has also survived for a long time, but new players like Kill Your Darlings and others, I just went blank on some of the others. Who did we hear from this morning? The Lifted Brow and a number of others are doing very well and are serving crucial roles as incubators for new writers. I believe, and although there aren't firm statistics to back this up, but I believe that Australians read as much as ever. But their buying patterns have changed dramatically already and will continue to change. Nielsen Bookscan, which is probably the best measure we have of book sales in this mainstream retail market, actually shows a very healthy pie, if you like, of the spread of book retail. A full third of their market share is independently owned bookshops. The other third are chain bookshops, but virtually every Dimmocks and Collins that's out there is actually a privately owned franchise. So effectively, 2/3 of the books that are being sold in Australia are being bought through independently owned businesses. The remaining third are mass market and discount stores, Targets and Big W's and whoever else, who again sell a lot of best-selling books, and a lot of the mass market books are picked up often at discount in those sort of mass retailers. But what Nielsen Bookscan's pie misses out on, it doesn't include even local online sellers, let alone overseas ones, and doesn't have any way of measuring ebook sales. This pie, this market split, is much more likely going 5 ways. Amazon and Book Depository combined have almost as much market share as any one local sector, worth hundreds of millions of dollars every year. This effectively is where the missing 20% has gone from the local market. This share of online and overseas sales will almost certainly continue to grow, and the local industry more than likely won't get it back. More and more of the best-selling titles will be bought online as ebooks or in print, and many consumers' default online choices are offshore ones. And you don't have to think only of buying books. If you just think of, I want to look at an online marketplace, you go to eBay. You know, there are default things. If you want to buy online music, most people's default would be iTunes. That's my phone quacking. We're now dealing not just with Amazon, but with Apple and Google. The global book industry is utterly tiny in comparison to these behemoths. I saw a figure somewhere that there was a lot of talk, and I'll come to this in a moment, about Penguin merging with Random House and how this was going to create the world's biggest trade publishing company. The combined turnover of Penguin and Random was something like 2% of Apple's. So, you know, if publishers are having to deal not only with Amazon, but with Google and with Apple, even a company the size of a combined Random Penguins, as we're inevitably going to call them, doesn't really have that much more leverage. While the book, as I said earlier, the book culture in Australia is very healthy and is increasingly diverse, not just a literary, high-end cultural book culture, there are no real signs that the pool of readers is increasing. Many of the communities and discussions that seem so vibrant are really talking among themselves. And it's a very important thing that all of these communities think outside of themselves and actually try and encourage broader readership rather than just discussion within their own little ponds. There's no real signs that the pool of readers is increasing, and it may well shrink as baby boomers die off, as older people who are keen readers are no longer there to buy books, and the next generation's reading and consumption habits change. Again, another comparison was the size of the book industry compared to the gaming industry, and I think the video game industry was something like 20 to 30 times the global turnover of all commercial book publishers. While there's an awful lot of book buzz going around, particularly online and in online communities, I really wonder if a lot of it is preaching to the converted. So here are some predictions, and my brief, I think I was meant to emphasise the positive or have a positive outlook. Some of these are positive, many of them unfortunately aren't all that positive, particularly in terms of the local commercial publishing industry. Parallel importation, while it's been debated over and over again over the last 20 years, I think is effectively dead. The next change of government, or even the next time this government brings it up, no matter what campaign the publishing industry puts up, I just think the consumer pressure will knock that off the statute books. But it might not even be necessary to take it off the statute books. Readers are doing their own parallel importing on a massive scale, and publishers have been forced to move closer to simultaneous release for many titles, with a recent voluntary code that would see most overseas published books be released in Australia within 14 days rather than 30. Although, in the speed of the online world, having to wait 2 weeks may still be too long for many readers. Global English language rights for books will become more and more prevalent, as will simultaneous worldwide publishing. Where this is going to leave author tours, writer festivals and associated marketing, which until now have been staggered with territory by territory release dates, is going to be a key problem for the trade to grapple with. Near parity pricing of Australian books in comparison to their overseas competitors will be essential, even if it seems commercially suicidal. And it's going to have to move quickly with currency fluctuations. The average retail price of books fell last year about 5 to 7%. It was still a single-digit percentage. And it still means that for consumers who can compare any price online very quickly, a US or UK edition is still always going to be pretty much half the price of a local one. As I say, it will be to many old hands commercially suicidal to try and match this, but I just think it's inevitable. The local offices of global publishers have already contracted. A lot of them have had restructures and reorganisations. They're going to have to continue to rationalise them and restructure themselves as the market shifts. One of the starkest examples of this recently was Murdoch Books, which was a long-established 15-year-old and apparently very successful until recently illustrated book publisher, lost its CEO, had a big restructure, sacked 20-something staff, and then its remaining owner put it up for sale. And Allen and Unwin have bought Murdoch Books, no doubt a much reduced Murdoch Books, which will become an imprint of Allen and Unwin. The other huge consolidation, obviously, that happened internationally was the announcement last week or the week before that Pearson are effectively selling Penguin. It was couched to Random House. It was couched in terms of a merger, but while you might think a merger would be 1 + 1 = 2, I suspect the even short-term reality will be 1 + 1 is going to equal 1.5, and in time I suspect both these venerable brands and these huge imprints will have to contract. And there'll be a lot of obvious contraction of staff in terms of duplication of services, of offices, of distribution. We have to wonder which of the big international players will be next to exit the market or to merge. Rupert Murdoch put his hand up and said that HarperCollins would be happy to pay $1 billion for Penguin. His offer was rejected, but it makes you wonder if he has $1 billion sitting around, who would he buy next? Pundits in the States seem to just suggest that Simon & Schuster would be the next on the block. So perhaps we might see Harper & Schuster within a pretty short space of time. Almost all of these biggest international companies are part of diversified cross-media businesses. How longer will News Corp, which owns HarperCollins, Viacom, which is the ultimate parent company of Simon & Schuster, Lagardère, which is a huge French media company which owns Hachette, how much longer will they want to own a book publishing arm? It's possible also locally that one or more of the well-known independent publishers won't be able to weather the changes and will have to close or merge. And I would hate to predict or see which one it would be, but it would be a very sad day if one of the prominent colophons on our shelves, which we've all come to love so much in the last 15 or 20 years, has to go. This also is my rather doomy prognosis. More bookshops will close. I suspect that suburban high street and regional town bookshops will be the next to suffer. This will affect both independently owned bookshops and franchise-owned chain stores. It's hard to know how much more contraction there will be in the retail book market, whether it'll be sudden or gradual. I think the exit of Red Group and Agus Robertson and Borders exposed this hole in the market, which I say hasn't been filled. If there continues to be even a slight downward trend, an awful lot of bookshops are not very profitable. They're barely marginable. And if it's a family business, whether it's independently owned or a franchise, a lot of people would have to look very seriously, and a lot of people's accountants would have to counsel them very seriously as to whether they can continue in business. However, existing largely inner city independent stores will continue to prosper if they continue to be smart and proactive with their connections to reader communities. Certainly every major city in Australia and many regional areas and towns have excellent independent bookshops or excellent franchise-owned chain bookshops that are doing so much more than simply opening their doors at 9 o'clock in the morning and putting someone behind the counter hoping that they'll come in and buy a book. Both Readings here in Melbourne and Glee Books in Sydney have, I believe, over 200 reader events every year. Fuller's does the same in Tasmania, Avid Reader and others do it in Brisbane. Those sort of community connections and direct connections with readers are absolutely crucial for retailers. There's no way that they can sit back and simply open the doors and stock the shelves and hope that customers will come in. Among online-only retailers, I wonder if there'll be more diversity or whether Amazon will eventually steamroller everyone. There are significant local online-only players in the Australian market. Booktopia is one example. It's been in the BRW's 50 fastest growing companies, I think, for the last 3 consecutive years. There are others, Fishpond in the Nile, and Angus & Robertson still lives on as an online brand currently owned by Pearson, which is also going to be interesting when Penguin and Random merge to see what happens with that. But I wonder whether all those online brands have a long-term future, again, when so many consumers' default choices are to go to the big river, as some people refer to it. One option in that, and one place where you might see diversity rather than consolidation, are that, again, among reader communities and among websites that deal with fans and with niche areas, a lot of those sites and a lot of the social reading sites like Goodreads and the like don't try to act directly as retailers, but they gain affiliate sales by directing their communities into particular bookshops. I'm getting close to time, so I might run through a few of these very quickly. I think Australian publishers will have to accept more of an incubator role for their local authors and be prepared to lose them to larger international players. But on the other hand, books that have an obvious or immediate international market it will be increasingly viable for them to be originated and published from Australia to the world. As a global English language rights rather than separate territory rights of selling a book to the US and to the UK and to Canada and to New Zealand and to South Africa and to wherever else in different editions will probably become less common. This little bit's headlined "Accentuate the Positives," because I've got to cheer you up before I let you go. Even if some of these things happen, a positive will be that the local industry will actually be more Australian and less of its energies will be focused on promoting the overseas originated titles that have been their bread and butter. As I've already mentioned, that local authors with global potential actually have better chances to get there. Literary mags and smaller publishers are flourishing, and they will actually become more important as incubators and as the home for adventurous publishing, perhaps as the larger players become more cautious. These smaller publishers often have less of a financial imperative. Some of the sessions we heard from this morning in the Spunk conference were very much talking about passion over profit. The term social entrepreneurship was thrown around quite a bit. And there'll be much more use of agile technology to get ideas and things out there quicker, and also to get rid of some of the barriers and the gatekeepers between authors, agents, publishers, booksellers, readers. There's been an awful lot of steps, and the connection between the writer and the reader is the fundamental one, and it often gets lost in among all the business and mediation that has had to go on in the traditional book trade.